Jeremiah Jones is the epitome of a neighbor who could give you a run for your money in terms of stress. He's a perfectionist with a flair for the arts, but I suspect his tendencies stem from his obsession with maintaining order and cleanliness at all times. I don't think he was always this way. Before his wife's passing, he was rarely seen outdoors, except when he returned from work in his gleaming Volkswagen. Now he has an abundance of time, which he devotes to cleaning and renovating almost daily. As he aged and retired, his pension should be more than sufficient after years of labor. I can't be certain, though. My mother believes it's terribly impolite to discuss finances, particularly someone else's, but I find that silly. It's just paper, after all. Perhaps solitude and time sparked this hobby or compulsive habit. Their home was never unsightly or dirty when his wife was around, but she was only occasionally outdoors. His methods are far more extreme. Jeremiah Jones was so consumed by perfection that he wouldn't risk his home showing any signs of dirt on the exterior, and I mean that in the most literal sense. It's not as if he's on the lookout for a bird or tree to leave a mark so he can climb up and paint over it. No, he's constantly taking preventive measures by painting the roof and walls every single day. Overkill, right? Initially, it wasn't completely mad. The neighbors even thought it was a pleasant diversion he'd discovered. You'd see him outside with a large can of blue paint, humming as he painted the left side of the house. A few days later, the entire house was blue, and it looked rather cool. An ocean blue house isn't something you see every day. He smiled and waved when I watched him from our porch. I waved back and even offered to help, but his smile quickly faded. No, you would just do it all wrong. When I frowned at his words, he quickly resumed smiling and added, "I'm just terribly particular, you know." I nodded and retreated indoors. The day after he finished painting everything blue, he was outside again at 5 a.m., before even the birds were awake. I was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy hitting the pavement outside our door. I instinctively leaped out of bed and peered out the window. While my mind was still foggy from sleep, I distinctly saw blood. It was trickling down Jeremiah Jones's window, and a large pool of it was forming next to the house. I screamed and yelled for my parents to call an ambulance. In their panic, they rushed to my room, and upon a second look, we realized that what I must have seen was red paint. Our neighbor was outside again, and the sound I heard must have been a can of red paint falling and spilling. He was using it to cover the previously blue walls. I guess he forgot to apply a white base first because the color didn't look as vibrant and clean as yesterday's blue. It looked sloppy and dirty. My parents went outside that morning to speak with him, but I didn't hear their conversation. I assumed they told him not to startle me so early in the morning. My mom was quite upset that he had to start painting so incredibly early. However, when they returned, her anger had turned into worry. "Poor man must be terribly missing Julie," she murmured. That was his wife's name, Julie Jones. "Is this why he's painting so much?" I asked her. Mom just shrugged. She held a deep affection for that home, always insisting on maintaining its cleanliness. I guess it's her legacy. In the ensuing days, Jeremiah dedicated himself to painting the walls and roof a vibrant red, a shade far removed from the rusty, blood-like hue it once bore. One afternoon, after stepping inside, I found myself casually sniffing the wall, as if to confirm to myself that it bore no scent of iron. Despite my morning fatigue making me believe I was seeing blood instead of paint, all I could detect was the chemical aroma of fresh paint. The next day, I was roused by the sounds of my indefatigable neighbor. This time, nothing was falling. Instead, he was humming a familiar tune. I glanced outside to see him atop his ladder, a new paint can and color swatch in hand. I merely rolled my eyes and retreated back to bed, but his humming soon escalated to whistling, robbing me of any further sleep. In the afternoon, my mother sent me next door with a casserole she had prepared earlier, an attempt to make amends for her previous rudeness towards Jeremiah. She had even spoken to other neighbors, many of whom expressed concern for the solitary old man. Many offered their assistance or company, but he always declined, insisting it was his task alone. When I delivered the lasagna my mother had made, he greeted me with a smile, and descended the ladder. "Tell your mother thank you, but it wasn't necessary. It must be quite bothersome living next to a construction site," he quipped. I laughed. "Oh, it's not a problem. I did have a fondness for the blue, though." The house was now a dark shade, a blend of forest green and brown. "I thought she would have too," he replied somberly, presumably referring to his wife. Unsure of how to respond, I asked, "Was blue her favorite color?" I remembered the ocean blue wall behind the piano where Mrs. Jones had given me lessons as a child. "I believe so," he said with a half smile. "But perhaps it wasn't." His words suggested he was painting the house to honor her. Perhaps this was his way of grieving, and finding the right color might help him move on. I nodded sympathetically and left him to his work, regretting my earlier annoyance. He was merely on a quest for the perfect color. The following day, he chose yellow and began even earlier, when it was technically still night. Yellow was an unfortunate choice, as the dark base layer of the house rejected such a light color. However, he seemed unfazed and went through at least a dozen cans of yellow paint before noon. After lunch, I ventured outside and asked why he hadn't applied a primer first. I was no expert painter, but it seemed logical. "Because it doesn't matter," he retorted sharply. "It will always shine through." He then resumed his loud humming, prompting me to retreat home. My sympathy soon morphed into concern as he persisted for weeks, painting every single day, rain or shine. He must be spending a fortune on all this paint. He's probably bought out every hardware store in town. The layers must be incredibly heavy by now, my father remarked over breakfast. It didn't seem as if Jeremiah was deriving any joy from his work. "Dad, how did his wife die?" I asked. I knew her death had been sudden, but I was unaware of the details. My father looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Jones was dealing with some health problems, but they weren't physical," my father began, his words stumbling out awkwardly. He was never adept at discussing serious matters. From his mumbled words, I gathered that Mrs. Jones had ended her own life within the confines of her home. If Mr. Jones was the one who discovered her, it would certainly explain his deep-seated trauma, particularly if he hadn't devoted much time to her, often returning home late from work. It seemed he was attempting to compensate for his past neglect, which only intensified my sympathy for him. His initial coping mechanism, while seemingly effective, had clearly become unhealthy. His once cheerful humming and whistling during his daily activities now sounded strained and off-key. The tune remained the same, its volume loud enough to reach our kitchen table. It was a familiar melody, but not one I would typically listen to. "That song," my father interjected, as if he had read my thoughts. "Isn't that the one Mrs. Jones taught you on the piano?" The last color Mr. Jones used on the house was black, the darkest shade I'd ever seen. He must have ordered it online from an unfamiliar brand. His previous meticulous painting had given way to a careless application of the dark color, with layers of paint dripping from the walls. As evening fell, the neighbors gathered once more. Jeremiah Jones was still outside, his clothes and face smeared with black paint. Some attempted to engage him in conversation, but he looked as if he hadn't slept in days and ignored them. If he responded at all, it was with nonsensical remarks. I began to wonder if something else had happened to his wife, something he had been shielded from due to his limited time spent in their ill-fated home. I had only interacted with Mrs. Jones during my piano lessons years ago, and she didn't seem particularly unwell to me. However, she was somewhat fastidious, and perhaps the isolation of the past few years had taken a toll on her. Now that Mr. Jones was spending all his time at home, it seemed to be affecting him as well. I tried to share my suspicions with my parents, but they dismissed my concerns about a cursed house with sympathetic smiles. Despite their skepticism, I was convinced something was amiss within that house. The events that transpired the night after the house was painted black confirmed my suspicions. It was late, and the street was eerily quiet. Mr. Jones had retreated inside an hour earlier, and it seemed the rest of Campbell Street was asleep. The residents here were mostly older and retired early, so I was likely the only one awake, plagued by insomnia. Perhaps it was the daily humming and whistling of our neighbor, but I couldn't shake the melody from my mind until I realized it wasn't just in my head. A faint melody was playing from outside. Under the dim streetlight, the blackened Jones's house blended into the night. There were no lights on inside, but music was playing softly. I can't fully explain my subsequent actions. Perhaps I was still half asleep and not thinking clearly, but the music piqued my curiosity to such an extent that I put on my sneakers and jacket and ventured onto our lawn. The melody was slightly louder outside, but still very faint. I doubted it was coming from inside the house. I knew Mrs. Jones had given away her piano years ago, and the sound wasn't coming from Mr. Jones. He could have been listening to it online or on a CD, but I was certain the music was emanating from the walls, not from within. I gulped, inching closer, questioning my sanity. I was inexplicably drawn to it, unable to articulate why. I found myself pressing my ear against the exterior of the house, only to pull away instantly. In the midst of my foolish actions, I had overlooked the fact that the house had been recently painted and was still damp. I wiped my face, expecting to see black paint on my hands, but instead, I found a different sticky substance. This time, it bore the unmistakable scent of iron. "The walls are bleeding," I murmured to myself. Just then, the window nearest to me creaked open. The sound sent a chill down my spine, causing me to stumble backward onto the ground. "What are you doing?" Mr. Jones hissed. He was attempting to keep his voice low, but his bloodshot eyes were more frightening than I had ever seen. "Do you wish to join her? Is that your desire?" He continued. I recoiled, filled with fear and shame. I was at a loss to explain my presence there. It felt as though an unseen force had drawn me to this place. I tried to respond, but Jeremiah Jones was already gripping the window frame, preparing to climb out. His manic expression was intensifying. I attempted to scream, but shock rendered me silent. Our neighbor, who had always been so gentle and courteous, seemed to have been driven mad by recent events. I feared the house had driven him to insanity. I struggled to rise from the dirt, but Mr. Jones was nearly outside, poised to attack. I'm certain he would have, had the commotion not awakened someone else. Perhaps it was because I wasn't tucked safely in bed, but when I heard my parents' footsteps rushing towards the lawn and their voices shouting, I knew I was safe. Safe from whatever Jeremiah Jones had intended. The disturbance roused more neighbors, and the police arrived shortly after. Initially, Mr. Jones's explanation seemed as insane as my theory of a haunted house. "It's bleeding. It's bleeding. It's bleeding and singing. She won't stop bleeding. She should have stopped." I will forever be puzzled by the events of that night. I often question whether I truly heard the music and saw the blood, as no one else appeared to have noticed. No one, except for me and our neighbor. Jeremiah Jones witnessed the house bleeding daily, which is why he attempted to cover it with paint. Perhaps it was a form of punishment, or maybe she was trying to warn us, and no one noticed. Because who could have known that she didn't harm herself, but that he was the one who caused her to bleed? Many have suggested that I'm overreacting, but there's a neighbor of mine who makes me feel quite uneasy. At first sight, he seems harmless, just an ordinary man, but his habit of lingering on the stairs near my hallway has always unsettled me. He just stands there, his hand resting on the railing, gazing down vacantly just a few feet from my door, which happens to be the first one near the stairs. I've observed him doing this multiple times through my peephole. I didn't hesitate to report this to the management, but they've yet to take any action. Apart from this, there's not much else to him. He just stands, stares, and then departs after a few minutes, so I can see why others might not be concerned. He's not technically causing any disturbance. I confess, I've been somewhat fixated on this man since I moved in this past January. I didn't notice him initially, not until the day I had to use a different stairwell. The one near my door was being repaired and repainted after someone had kicked a hole in the wall during a party, so I had to use the stairwell on the other side of the building that day to reach my car. As I turned the corner, I noticed him from a distance in what would become his usual spot. He was wearing muddy shoes that were smearing the fresh paint on the stairs beneath him, completely disregarding the wet paint sign beside him. He was dressed in a worn-out sweater and had long brown hair tied back in a disheveled ponytail. I wasn't immediately alarmed, but that changed after I greeted him on my way in and received no reply, just his vacant stare directed at the ground. I quickly locked the door behind me and couldn't resist peeking out. He was still there, still staring. From that day forward, I began checking every day to see if I could catch him in the act. And sure enough, I did. However, there was no consistency to the times. It seemed random, but somehow he always managed to catch my attention. Sometimes I just had a feeling he would be there, as if I was being watched, and I was always right. There were times when I'd look out and see nothing, of course, but it always felt like I could sense his presence when he was there. Around the third week, I texted all of my friends and family and tried to make sense of it. Everyone I spoke to about it was equally disturbed and advised me to contact management. My mom even suggested calling the police. But of course, that wouldn't lead anywhere. No threats, no violence, no disturbance, and no case. Just a man with an apparent staring problem that no one else had reported. So I did my best to ignore him. But tonight he finally moved closer to my door, and I'm unsure how to react. After a tough day at work and a challenging time getting to class due to my car needing repairs, I was in a terrible mood by the time I got home to my apartment that evening. The cool air inside the building was a welcome relief from the sticky humidity I'd just cycled home in, and I felt as if I'd just completed a marathon. My feet were barely able to carry me up the stairs, but I hurried up anyway, eagerly anticipating the comfort of my couch. I was so rushed that I barely noticed him when I turned the corner. As soon as I looked up, I couldn't suppress the sigh that escaped me. All I wanted was a break from the day, and now this man was outside my door again to spoil my evening. Frustrated and irritated, I muttered, "Could you get any closer, dude?" As I shuffled past him. As expected, there was no reply or recognition, prompting me to sigh and enter my flat. I promptly locked the door, a habit I've always adhered to before daring to peek at him. My heart froze the moment I caught sight of the man's face, alarmingly close to my door viewer. The shock was so intense that I nearly stumbled while retreating from the door. His countenance had morphed into a broad, eerie smile, revealing discolored and jagged teeth. He remained utterly motionless, his gaze fixed. This is my current predicament. He has been rooted to the spot for the last 4 hours, his unblinking stare and unsettling smile unwavering. The fear of diverting my gaze from the peephole compelled me to drag a chair to the door, preventing my legs from collapsing. This is the longest I've ever endured his gaze, and it's petrifying. I'm still a stranger in this building, and my nearest acquaintance is almost 40 miles away. My pleas to the police have fallen on deaf ears. They remain unresponsive unless there's a direct threat, and no one else in my building has lodged a complaint. I doubt I'll be able to sleep tonight or go to work tomorrow. All I yearn for is an end to this relentless staring. As my eyes meticulously scanned the seemingly infinite expanse of the dark road that stretched out before us, my husband gently tapped me on the shoulder. As I turned to face him, I was met with the blurry radiance of light reflecting off his phone screen, casting an ethereal glow in the surrounding darkness. The screen displayed directions to a quaint little motel that was a mere 10 minutes away. We were traversing the historic Route 66, specifically on Pavers Road. We had bid farewell to our apartment several hours ago. The purpose of our journey was to visit my relatives, who resided quite a distance away from our apartment complex. The journey was anticipated to take at least a full day, and we had optimistically hoped to reach our destination by sundown. However, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of twilight, we found ourselves still more than 4.5 hours away. Earlier, My husband had proposed the idea of finding a motel to rest for the night. I had concurred, and thus, our search began. It felt like an eternity had passed before he found a motel that wasn't absurdly distant. The motel was a small, dingy establishment that didn't appear to be well maintained, but it was our last resort since there weren't any other options for several hours down the road. However, as we approached the motel, a sense of unease began to creep over me. This feeling of discomfort intensified the closer we got to the motel. Then I saw the sign. All that was visible was the faint red glow that was almost entirely swallowed by the surrounding darkness. Pavers Road Motel, it read. A chill ran down my spine as I read the sign. I was consumed by a sense of dread. I abruptly brought the car to a halt and voiced my concerns to my husband, stating that this was a bad idea. He chuckled and dismissed my fears, saying, "It's probably nothing." Despite my best efforts, I couldn't convince him otherwise. He suggested that my apprehension was likely due to fatigue and offered to take over the driving. Reluctantly, I agreed. He urged me to try and put my worries aside, and I did my best to comply. We pulled into the parking lot and made our way into the motel. Upon entering, we found the front desk deserted, save for a solitary bell. The room was permeated with the smell of ashes, as if someone had just extinguished a candle. Everything was coated with a thick layer of dust, suggesting that the place hadn't been cleaned in years. The only exception was the bell, which had a peculiar shine to it. It was unnaturally clean. Everything felt wrong. Very, very wrong. I turned around to see my husband poised to ring the bell. Before I could utter a word, he had already rung it. The sound echoed in my ears, amplifying my sense of dread. Overwhelmed, I closed my eyes and began to sob uncontrollably. Suddenly, I felt someone shaking me. Instinctively, I opened my eyes to find my husband standing next to me, a look of concern etched on his face. He immediately inquired if I was okay. Instead of responding, I asked him who had answered the bell. No one. I rang it like 3 or 4 times, but no one answered. He replied. A wave of relief washed over me. He was right. Everything was fine. I had just been overreacting. Once again, he asked if I was okay and suggested that I lay down. I declined his offer and insisted that we leave this place immediately. As we made our way back to the car, he suggested that I rest for the remainder of the drive. I agreed, and we got into the car and drove off. We had only been driving for about 10 minutes when we saw it again. The faint red glow of a sign, almost entirely shrouded by the darkness. Pavers Road Motel. During the previous year, my closest companion, Allie, and I embarked on an exciting American journey, aiming to ski in as many states as we could during our month-long break from work. Our trip was filled with skiing, driving, and sleeping in a variety of places, including couches, truck stops, and naturally, motels. Most motels were decent. Some offered excellent complimentary breakfasts. Some had unclean hot tubs that led to jokes about potential waterborne pregnancies after thorough showers. Some had peculiar stains we chose to ignore. Some were immaculate but chilly. A few were exceptional. However, one was downright horrifying. After a long day of skiing and 6 hours of driving, we arrived at the motel around 10:30. We were exhausted, aching, and ready for sleep. We had taken a few wrong turns and were uncertain of our exact location. We avoided using data on our Canadian phones and instead navigated using a traditional map. It wasn't entirely successful, but we were fairly certain we had a few more hours of driving until the next town, which we weren't eager to undertake. So, when we saw the bright neon sign flashing motel and vacancy, we didn't need to discuss it. We both knew this was our stop for the night. As we parked in front of the office, I noticed we were the only guests. I reassured myself that it wasn't eerie, considering we were near a summer tourist spot in the middle of winter. It was expected that there would be plenty of vacant rooms. In fact, we should feel fortunate that they were open at all. It was definitely not eerie. Upon entering the office, a piercing bell announced our arrival. We waited for someone to appear at the front desk. Then we waited some more. We exchanged glances, raised eyebrows, and tapped our fingers on the desk impatiently. "Hello?" Allie broke the silence. "Is anyone here?" After a few more minutes, the door behind the counter slowly opened. An elderly man peeked out, saw us, and his face lit up with a broad smile. "Guests," he exclaimed. "You know, I thought I heard something, but I dismissed it as my imagination. Just my imagination. We don't have many visitors at this time of year, and two lovely young ladies at that. Ah, I apologize for the wait. I just couldn't believe my luck." Welcome. He was certainly peculiar, but having worked long, lonely night shifts myself, I understood the thrill of something happening. "So, weary travelers, may I offer you a bed to rest your weary heads?" He smiled. "Sure, how much for a double room?" He looked at us, his smile unwavering. $99 for 2 beds. $79 for 1 bed. I was prepared to pay extra for the 2 beds. Allie was a restless sleeper and tended to monopolize the covers. She had kept waking me up the previous night. "Let's go for 2 beds," I pleaded with her. She shot me a quick, annoyed glance. I turned back to the man. His smile had faded. He looked as irritated as Allie for a moment. When he noticed me looking at him, his smile quickly returned. Actually, it seems we only have the 1-bed rooms ready. I'm so sorry." "Wait, what?" I couldn't help but exclaim. "There's practically no one here." "Oh yes, that is the problem, isn't it? Sometimes we don't prepare all the rooms in winter. It saves costs, you see." I pondered that. It didn't make sense at all, but I was too weary to argue. "You know what, for such lovely ladies, I'll give you a discount. How about $69 for the 1-bedroom? "We'll take it," Allie replied before I had a chance to think. "Thank you. We can pay by card, right?" No, I'm afraid not. We never adopted that modern technology. Gotta stay off the grid, right?" He chuckled at his own joke. I involuntarily shivered. We possessed the necessary funds. Everything seemed okay. The man was unsettling, but our exhaustion overpowered any unease. We handed over the money, received the keys, and drove to our assigned room. I collected my belongings from the car, unlocked the door, and inspected the room. It appeared clean. The bed was spacious, and my fatigue was overwhelming. "Actually, I think I'll stretch my legs with a short walk," Allie suggested from behind me. "Care to join?" I glanced at the inviting bed. It was too tempting. Allie's suggestion was sensible, but the bed was beckoning me. "No, I think I'll just take a shower and hit the hay." "All right, I won't be long." She departed, and I closed the door behind me, quickly shedding my clothes. I stepped into the shower, relishing the sensation of warm water cascading down my body. I had to muster the willpower to step out. I dressed in my pajamas and collapsed onto the bed. Allie hadn't returned yet, but her nocturnal walks could sometimes last up to an hour, even when she was as tired as she was now. They seemed to help her sleep. I attempted to connect to the Wi-Fi on my phone, but to no avail. I felt a surge of irritation. Not because I desperately needed the Wi-Fi, but because I had paid for it and expected it to work. So I lay there, stewing in annoyance, my gaze fixed on the peculiar ceiling fan. It was an unusual design, with something black protruding from the bottom. I had never seen anything like it before and wondered what its purpose was. Then, I began to dwell on the fact that we were the only guests here. that Allie was out there alone in the darkness, that I had no idea where she was, and how unnerving the man had been when he joked about staying off the grid. A familiar sense of dread began to creep into my consciousness. I knew where my thoughts were heading. I have a tendency to imagine the worst-case scenario in every situation, turning it into a horror movie in my mind. It's a real issue in my romantic relationships. I often suspect men of being serial killers. Ally always teases me about it. I recalled how the man had initially offered us 2 beds, then denied us. Did he specifically want us in this room? Why? Perhaps he had some perverse fantasy about 2 young girls sharing a bed. Disgusted, I shook my head, trying to halt the spiraling thoughts. I got up from the bed and approached the large mirror on the wall. I untied my hair from the towel and began to brush it. An uneasy feeling lingered in the pit of my stomach. I knew I wouldn't sleep well that night. For some reason, I thought of the one-way mirror scene in Cabin in the Woods. Why do I subject myself to horror movies? They always resurface in my mind at the worst possible times. So unsettling. I vaguely remembered that there's a way to determine if a mirror is genuine. What was it again? You touch the mirror, and if there's no gap between your finger and its reflection, it's not a real mirror? I touched the mirror. There was no gap. I could see the fear widening in my eyes in the mirror. No, wait, that can't be right. I tried to reassure myself. That's absurd. Everything is fine. We're fine. It must be the other way around. But maybe... I realized I could compare it to the bathroom mirror. It was one of those medicine cabinet mirrors, definitely genuine. I slowly made my way to the bathroom. Please be the same, please be the same, please be the same, I muttered under my breath. I wiped the fogged mirror, took a deep breath, and cautiously pressed my index finger against the surface. A chill ran down my spine. There was a gap. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. We needed to leave. Where was Allie? Panic was beginning to set in. I needed to get out. But I had to act normal. They could be watching. Who were they? I couldn't let them know that I was onto them. I had to escape. A dark object on the ceiling fan caught my eye. My heart pounded in my chest. It had to be a surveillance device. I retreated to the bedroom, began to repack my belongings into my small bag. I hoped it appeared innocuous. Perhaps we were just early risers, or maybe I was a stickler for organization. I attempted to leave the room to place the bag in the car. The doorknob wouldn't budge. I tried to maintain my composure, aware that we could be under observation. Perhaps the door was merely stuck. I tried again, exerting all my strength. Still, it remained immovable. I reached for my phone, intending to send a message to Allie or alert the authorities. But there was no signal. Despair washed over me. I scanned the room for an escape route and noticed for the first time the barred windows. I'd seen such security measures before in my city apartment to prevent break-ins. But now, they seemed more like a trap, preventing escape. I reasoned that the door could only be unlocked from the outside. Once inside, there was no way out. I clung to the hope that Allie would return, unlock the door, and we could escape. The following minutes felt like an eternity as I struggled to formulate a plan, my thoughts clouded by adrenaline. Finally, I heard footsteps approaching. Allie had returned. I stood by the door as she inserted the key and turned the lock. The door swung open. "Allie, we need to leave immediately," I urged, guiding her out of the room. "Why? What's going on?" "There's a hidden camera in the room," I whispered urgently, pushing her towards the car. Fear widened her eyes, and she complied without question. I unlocked the car, tossed my bag in the back, and we both scrambled inside. Suddenly, the door to the neighboring room flew open, and an elderly man emerged, charging towards us. He pounded on the hood of the car, as if he could physically prevent our escape. We screamed in unison as I sped away. Despite my panic, I noticed several figures in the room behind him. He wasn't alone. I drove non-stop, praying we weren't being pursued. "We need to contact the police," Allie declared after an hour on the road. "It's necessary." I agreed. She used her remaining data to locate the local sheriff's office and dialed their number. I only caught snippets of the conversation. "Hello, I need to report a potential crime." "No, this isn't a prank. We were staying at a motel and we found a hidden camera." "And a one-way mirror," I added. "What?" She looked at me confused. "Tell them about the mirror." "And a one-way mirror. The door wouldn't unlock from the inside," she relayed, seeking my confirmation. I nodded. There were people behind that mirror too. Fear flashed in her eyes as she repeated the information, then described the motel's location. "Yes." "No." She sounded unsure. "We were on a skiing trip," she explained, frowning. "Okay. No, we'd rather not." I gave her a puzzled look. "No, really, we've already left the state. We just wanted to inform you." She ended the call abruptly. "What happened?" "He wanted us to return and provide a statement." "Shouldn't we?" She was silent for a moment. "I don't know. I got a bad feeling about it. Let's not, okay? A small-town American sheriff's office? That's exactly how you end up dead in horror movies. But we're not in a horror movie. Aren't we?" I shrugged. I wasn't keen on the idea of returning either. I was still concerned that we were being followed. I didn't want to risk a confrontation with a deranged motel manager. We had informed the police. We had done our part. At least that's what I believed. Yesterday, a news story reported the disappearance of 3 young girls who were on a road trip in the same area. They never returned to Seattle. It makes me wonder if they might have stopped at the same motel we did. I can't help but speculate about the sequence of events if Allie hadn't decided to take that walk. What if we had both been trapped in that room? What were the intentions of the people in the adjacent room? Were they merely observers, or were they planning something more sinister? It's chilling to think that Allie and I could have been the subjects of that missing persons report. Tonight, I have the opportunity to accompany my father to his workplace. This is a moment I've envisioned each time I saw him vanish behind the towering iron gates at our backyard's end. My peers at school would often ridicule me for my place of residence and my family's occupation. As I navigated the school corridors, whispers of Spooky Adam would follow me. My father always maintained that his job was a privilege, a legacy passed down to our family by the town 3 centuries ago, and that one day, it would be my responsibility too. Our home was an ancient structure, situated on the periphery of the town's largest cemetery. As I matured, the imagined monsters lurking beyond the massive iron gates lost their terror. Each night, I would observe him amble down the footpath, the clanging of the gate setting off a chorus of canine howls under the night sky. The nature of his graveyard duties or the reason for his nocturnal schedule remained a mystery to me. I fancied that the monsters feared my father, given his consistent return home with a smile, as though he'd spent the night in playful activities. However, recently, he's been returning home looking as if he'd been in a brawl, sporting injuries and bruises. One morning, I found him tending to a black eye, and when I inquired about it, he humorously claimed to have had a scuffle with a ghost. As we treaded the overgrown path leading to the gate, I was seized by a sense of anxious anticipation. My father's face lit up as he inserted the key into the lock, saying, "I've been eagerly awaiting this day since I first crossed these gates with my own father. Today, son, you transition into manhood." A blanket of mist enveloped the ground, as if shielding the slumbering souls from the biting cold. We ventured deep into the graveyard's uncanny darkness. With each step, my heart pounded harder. I attempted to conceal my anxiety from my father, but let out a girlish shriek when a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. My gasp echoed through the silence when the figure stepped into the moonlight, flashing me a twisted grin. "Don't be frightened. That's Alan, the gravedigger." As we approached another set of gates under the dimming moonlight, my father said, "Behind this gate rest the souls of the town's forgotten children." He produced another set of keys and unlocked the gate, advising, "No matter what you hear or see, try not to be scared." An unsettling silence descended upon us as the gate clanged shut. The small corner of the graveyard was dotted with tiny, unmarked graves. My father froze as a giggle echoed through the air. "Dad, did you hear that?" He shot me a playful glance, warning, "You need to stay alert around these two pranksters." Suddenly, I found myself tumbling to the ground as two spectral figures darted past me, their laughter ringing in my ears as I picked myself up from the frosty ground. Meet the twins, Ronnie and Theodore. They're quite the tricksters, so keep an eye out for them. A rumbling noise approached me from a large crypt at the graveyard center, accompanied by a foul odor. "That's Trevor. Whatever you do, don't let him sit on you. Remember the week our house reeked as if something had died?" I stared at my father in disbelief. "Mind-blowing, isn't it?" he said, grinning. I was overwhelmed with questions, but words failed me. I was terrified, yet fascinated. These children are remnants of our town's grim past. Many of these kids are nameless. A sudden chill ran down my spine. "You mean there are more ghosts?" My father chuckled. "There are a few more, some visible. Others just pass through like a winter breeze." My father paused at one of the crypts while I continued walking. The melodious voice of a girl singing wafted from behind one of the graves, drawing me deeper into the graveyard. Out of nowhere, a little girl materialized, sitting cross-legged on the floor, swaying gently. Her eyes met mine as she opened her mouth, and a divine melody flowed from her. As I approached, the music abruptly ceased, and her eyes welled up with sorrow. Rising to her feet, tears cascaded down her cheeks. She let out a piercing scream and charged towards me. I steeled myself for the collision, but she passed through me like a chilling wind, vanishing into the fog. My father's voice echoed from the shadows. "I'm here, Dad. I'm safe." He materialized, a look of worry etched on his face. "I see you've met Isabella. Don't fret about her. Her bark is worse than her bite." His voice wavered as he spoke, his eyes darting nervously into the darkness. "There's something you should know." A shiver ran down my spine, and the hair on my neck stood on end. The graveyard reverberated with a crackling noise. "Not all spirits here are benign. Some carry the torment of their past lives into the afterlife." A menacing shadow materialized behind my father. "We're done playing with you," a petulant child's voice rang out. My father was suddenly hoisted off the ground by his neck. The shadowy figure tightened its grip. Gasping for air, he fumbled in his pocket and tossed a large red ball to me. "Throw the ball. You need to engage them." I hurled the ball, and a gust of wind swept past me as my father collapsed. He sprinted towards the gate, leaving me locked in with the spectral entities. Panic seized me as I raced to the gate, begging my father to release me. "I've grown too old for their games. I'm not entertaining anymore. Now it's your turn." He smiled at me as the sound of giggles echoed from the darkness. "These children are lost souls. They were solitary in life, and so they remain in death. It's our family's duty to provide them with amusement." The red ball I had thrown rolled back from the darkness, stopping at my feet. "If we don't entertain them, they'll become irate. We can't let that happen again." A hospital. It's a sanctuary where the ill are treated, the injured mended, and the dying given a chance at life. It's also a birthplace for new lives. Some might see it as a refuge of recovery and joy. Yet others may have a different perspective. To them, a hospital is a site of suffering, grief, and mortality. A place where the phrase, "it's nothing serious," is often a blatant untruth. They might even compare it to a prison, confined in a barren room with machines tethered to you, and silence stalking you every minute. As for my perspective, I align with the latter. After a mere 3 hours into my first day as an admissions clerk, I can confidently say it's far from a refuge. And her patients, sicker, arrive with faces etched with fear, uncertain of their impending diagnosis. The hospital had only been operational for a month, and just the previous day, they had posted an urgent job advertisement for a night shift clerk. The salary package was attractive, so I naturally applied. Within an hour, I received a call from a hospital representative. He proposed conducting the interview over the phone, to which I agreed. After providing what I believed were satisfactory answers, the caller seemed pleased and extended a job offer. I was instructed to start the following day, which seemed rather swift. I surmised they were understaffed, given the speedy hiring process. That's how I found myself employed at this hospital. The hospital's structure reveals its contemporary design, a compact, minimalist, square-shaped edifice with glass windows adorning each floor. Although the hospital wasn't massive, its neat and simple design distinguished it from the dilapidated buildings around it. The ground floor was fully functional, but construction on the upper floors up to the 3rd level had unexpectedly halted, presumably due to funding issues. Upon entering the hospital, the admissions desk greets you on the left center, with an elevator directly opposite on the far right. Patient wards flank either side of the admissions desk. The ward doors feature a high-tech locking system that only responds to a special keycard provided to all staff members. Various rooms allocated to doctors are situated at the front and right side of the hospital. During peak hours, both patients and doctors can be seen frequently entering and exiting these rooms. A notable feature of the hospital's interior is the absence of stairs leading to the upper floors. The elevator, currently out of service due to construction, is the sole access point to them, but this wasn't a concern as I was informed there was nothing on the upper floors. My shift commenced at 8 p.m., and by 11 p.m., I was considerably worn out. I glanced to my left and noticed Mr. Rayahim, my colleague and superior, seemed perfectly fine. Engaging with so many patients have really taken a toll on me. How do you manage to stay so energetic and fresh after all this work? I asked Mr. Rayahim as I rested my head on the desk. Well, I've been here for about a year, so I've adapted, Mr. Rayahim replied with a smile. Besides, it's not that much work anyway, so get up. I don't want to see you slacking on your first day. I groaned as I rose. Thankfully, there hadn't been any new patients for a while, so I managed to catch a brief respite. A pair of nurses walked past us, whispering amongst themselves. They seemed somewhat anxious as they settled down on a couch some distance away from me. The only words I could discern from their conversation were, "disappeared," and "I hope they find her." They seem a bit distressed. Is everything okay with them? I asked Mr. Rahim, who was also observing the nurses. He didn't respond immediately. As I turned to look at him, I saw a look of concern etched on his face. Now that you're part of the team, it's only fair you're in the loop, Mr. Rahim declared. About what? I interjected, curious about his impending revelation. 2 days ago, we lost track of a patient. Unfortunately, we have no clue about their whereabouts. Could the patient have just left the premises? I knew it was a naive question, but I couldn't resist asking. That's a possibility. However, the patient, Ms. Lubna, a 48-year-old woman, was suffering from rapidly progressing ataxia and acute blindness. It's unlikely she could have left unaided. Moreover, the hospital has only 2 exits, and the CCTV footage doesn't show her leaving. The windows are also not an option as they are permanently sealed. Have the police been notified? Not yet. The hospital management fears it might tarnish the hospital's reputation, so we're trying to locate the patient ourselves. But that's not the only problem. There's more? Yes, the clerk you replaced, Mr. Cameron, has also been missing since that day. The last footage of him shows him entering the patient's ward. After that, both he and Ms. Lubna disappeared without a trace. I tried to process this information. It felt like a prank, like Mr. Rahim was pulling my leg on my first day, but his serious demeanor suggested otherwise. Don't overthink this. I just wanted you to be aware. For now, concentrate on your work. Easier said than done. How could I ignore such a story and focus on work? I nodded and started organizing some documents. It was nearing midnight. Dr. Hassan and Dr. Faizan were casually chatting while 3 nurses lounged on the couches. Essentially, the night shift staff was whiling away time in the main area. I was aimlessly scrolling through social media when a ding interrupted us. The elevator panel lit up, indicating it was descending from the 3rd floor. Mr. Rahim, I thought the upper floors were vacant, I questioned, puzzled. So did I, Mr. Rahim replied as he stood and moved to the front, obstructing my view. Another ding signaled the elevator's arrival on the ground floor. The doors began to open slowly. I strained to see who was inside, but my view was blocked. Then, a nurse's scream echoed through the room, followed by Mr. Rahim's chilling words. "Dear Lord." I rose from my chair and was nearly sick at the sight. In the middle of the elevator lay a grotesquely disfigured body. The arms and legs had been torn off and swapped, with legs protruding from the arm sockets and vice versa. The head had been cleanly severed and placed in the chest cavity. The elevator was drenched in blood, and the phrase, "not the one," was scrawled on the back wall in blood. Everyone was paralyzed with shock. Dr. Hassan was the first to snap out of it and approach the body. He called for assistance to move the body, but no one budgeted. He then gestured towards me, jolting me back to reality. I shakily assisted him in moving the body out of the elevator. As soon as we stepped out, the elevator doors closed behind us, and the power shut off. In a state of shock, Dr. Faizan yelled, "What on earth has occurred, and who does this corpse belong to?" Mr. Rahim and Dr. Hassan began to cautiously inspect the body. Abruptly, Mr. Rahim halted and cried out, "My God, I believe this is Kamran. His face is severely mutilated, but he was dressed in these clothes the day he vanished." I struggled to process the situation. The former clerk had reappeared, dead and grotesquely disfigured, presumably the victim of a deranged murderer. This meant we had a serious issue to deal with. We should contact the police immediately. There might be a homicidal maniac lurking on the upper floors, I suggested. Dr. Faizan retorted, "Absolutely not. The owners explicitly instructed us to handle the situation without involving any external parties. I refuse to lose my job over some overzealous youngster. Have you lost your mind? We're dealing with a dead body. This is beyond our capacity to resolve." Dr. Faizan's words were absurd. How could we possibly apprehend a suspected murderer? Dr. Hassan intervened. "Enough. Let's relocate the body for now and clean up the blood. We have patients in the ward, and it would be disastrous if any of them saw this. For now, we should keep this to ourselves and figure out our next steps." Mr. Rahim added, "Indeed, it would be prudent to shut down the hospital for the night to prevent anyone else from entering." His eyes were filled with fear. Dr. Hassan agreed and momentarily turned away. I could clearly see the terror in his eyes. He was doing his best to remain composed, but the events were overwhelming. Dr. Hassan then faced us again and assigned tasks to each of us. Despite some grumbling, Dr. Faizan and 2 nurses moved the corpse to the emergency room. Another nurse and Dr. Hassan went to reassure the other patients in the ward, attributing the commotion to a drunken intruder. Mr. Rahim and I were tasked with securing the entrance. We lowered the shutters in front of the hospital doors and switched off the exterior lights. I can't comprehend what's happening. First, 2 people disappear and now one of them has turned up dead, Mr. Rahim murmured. I was equally unsettled. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I locked the shutter in place. Around 1 a.m., we reconvened in the lobby. I was the first to speak. What's our next move? If we're lucky, we'll survive the night. But what then? Dr. Hassan replied, ideally, we'd alert the police, but as Dr. Faizan noted, we can't involve outsiders. If the killer escapes via the roof, we'd be the prime suspects. Additionally, we failed to ensure our patient's safety, as Ms. Lubna is still unaccounted for. I was about to respond when the lights suddenly went out. Even the backup generator failed to kick in. The only illumination came from the streetlights outside. Before we could react, the elevator panel lit up with a ding, and the elevator began to ascend to the 3rd floor. Everyone finds a hiding place. Either the killer is sending Ms. Lubna, or they're coming down themselves, Dr. Hassan ordered. The doctors and nurses quickly concealed themselves in the doctors' rooms. Mr. Rahim and I took cover under the admissions desk. I dread to think what the killer might have done to Ms. Lubna's body. I tried to steady my breathing to avoid detection. After about 10 seconds, a ding shattered the silence, and I heard the elevator doors open. I held my breath, hoping for the best, but of course I was wrong. Following the sound of the doors opening, I heard a footstep, then another. Whoever it was had just exited the elevator. The elevator doors then closed. An individual was gradually approaching the reception desk. I covered my mouth with my hand to suppress any sound. I was clueless about their identity. Could it be the murderer? Did they carry any weapons? Their footsteps halted. A mere wooden partition was all that stood between us. A thud echoed from the desk above me. Is anyone present? The voice was feminine. Mr. Rahim mouthed, Ms. Lubna. I attempted to rise, but he restrained me, signaling to wait. Suddenly, his eyes widened in shock, staring at something behind me. I slowly pivoted and was petrified. It was dark, but the streetlights outside provided just enough illumination. Ms. Lubna's neck had elongated to 10 meters, and her head was probing behind me. The faint tapping on the desk indicated her body hadn't moved. Fear gripped me. I was paralyzed, unable to comprehend the sight. Where are you? Ms. Lubna's tone was almost taunting. Her head swiveled and our eyes locked. They were stark white, and she wore a grin. After a moment, her head methodically scanned Mr. Rahim and me before retracting. Footsteps receded from the desk. Where are you, dear? Won't anyone greet me? I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath. My hands were trembling violently. Mr. Rahim was perspiring heavily. What is that entity? I stammered. Mr. Rahim merely shook his head, seemingly speechless. A door to the right opened, and hurried footsteps approached Ms. Lubna. It's Ms. Lubna. She seems fine. We should check her for injuries. It was Dr. Faizan. Doctor, wait, something's off, Dr. Hassan warned, but it was too late. Dear, is that you? I peered over the desk to witness the unfolding horror. Dr. Faizan halted a few steps from Ms. Lubna. Dear, you seem unwell. Allow me to assist. Ms. Lubna leaped onto Dr. Faizan. What are you doing, woman? Get off! Dr. Faizan protested. A bone-cracking sound was followed by a scream. Ms. Lubna tore off Dr. Faizan's right arm. His agonized howls filled the air as blood splattered the floor. Yes, yes! Let the warm lifeblood flow and drench me in crimson. Let me savor the elixir of your sacrifice, Ms. Lubna exclaimed. Fear immobilized me once more. Mr. Rahim was similarly transfixed, unable to tear his gaze away from the gruesome scene. In the dim light, it appeared as though Ms. Lubna thrust her hand into Dr. Faizan's chest, after which he ceased to move. Oh dear, you've stopped moving. You weren't the one then, Ms. Lubna rose. I sensed another presence nearby. I'll ensure my toys don't escape just yet. She raised her hands skyward and began chanting in an unfamiliar language. As she finished, A searing pain shot through my left wrist. Mr. Rahim was clutching his left hand too. The pain subsided after a few seconds, leaving a red mark resembling a division symbol. Ms. Lubna dragged Dr. Faizan's body with one hand and his severed arm with the other towards the elevator. You might not be the perfect fit, but you're suitable for the time being. The lift doors parted, and she stepped in, hauling Mr. Faizan's lifeless body. Her grin, stained with blood, was the last thing I saw before the lift doors reunited. The lift ascended to the 3rd level, and then the control panel went dark. Simultaneously, the hospital's lights flickered back to life. What just transpired? Mr. Rahim inquired. Baffled, Dr. Hassan emerged from his office, having apparently shut the door when Ms. Lubna assaulted Dr. Faizan. I hesitate to use this term as it undermines my professionalism, but that entity was not human. It was unmistakably a demon, Dr. Hassan declared. A nurse who had been hiding sprinted towards the hospital exit, muttering, "I don't want to die." As she reached for the door, a scream escaped her lips, and she collapsed. Somehow, I found the strength to rush to her side, with Dr. Hassan following closely. Her left arm was severely burnt, which caused her pain. "What is happening?" Dr. Hassan whispered. We helped the nurse to a couch and tried to make her comfortable. Soon, patients began to emerge from their rooms, drawn by the scream. Some were clutching their left wrists, presumably marked like the nurse. The sight of blood in the lobby stopped them in their tracks. "Is that blood?" one patient asked, horrified. "We are dealing with a crisis," Dr. Hassan admitted, struggling to keep his fear hidden. I glanced at the lift, its panel blank, as if it had never been activated.